Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Vunga washing station, wash processed Rwanda from SK Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And SK, based out of St. Paul, Minnesota. And this coffee is our November 2023 Coffee of the Month, as it was voted on by you guys as the coffee you most wanted to see us review. This is also SK's third ever appearance on this channel, as they were originally suggested to us by Maddie Tees. So shout out to and thank you to Maddie for the suggestion. And when I was looking through coffees for the potential Coffee of the Month poll, this one caught my interest because of the very unique purple gemstone note that they had listed on there. Couple that with the fact that I'm a big fan of maple and that we don't review too many Rwandan coffees throughout the year, I felt like this was a great entrant for that Coffee of the Month poll, and it won a very closely contested Coffee of the Month poll. So we will see if this one ended up living up to the very unique descriptors that they have on it, as this right here is day 29. And recipe we went with for this coffee was actually no recipe, as I found it most enjoyable through the automatic coffee makers. So that was our preferred brew method for this one. Roast profile for this coffee, though, did end up being a little bit more on the developed side of things than I might have expected going into it, though that's been my previous experiences with this coffee roaster as well, as I feel like most people would closely align this with the more developed side of a medium light in terms of that roast profile. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 10, first impression, and we opted for the V60 with there being a ton in this cup, as it started out with an intense fruit aroma in the brew and can immediately be felt that there's more development than initially expected from what we had based off previous experiences. Though, that being said, I mean, it's one of those things where the previous experiences, I'm like, okay, I can kind of see it going a lot of ways, but with this one, I said, this should probably, in theory, maybe be on the lighter side of things, given what this coffee is. Even then, that wasn't necessarily the case. I'm not saying that it was pushing too far, but even then, just a little bit more developed than what I typically review on this channel. An abundance of darker themed aspects in line with the listed purple gemstones, as I felt, okay, there's plenty of fruit brightness and kind of interesting quality. A slight papery sense to it with a little bit of smokiness as well as sweetness. So it was an interesting first impression, as I felt like there were a lot of positives, but at the same time, there were some slight drawbacks too. Day 12 opted for the Chemex, and it was offering more of the same with a slight lingering smokiness in the cup, but also a little bit more citric brightness and a lingering dark fruit berry aspect also being present. This time I felt it was a little bit more defined of a darker tart berry, giving it some slight Kenyan-like characteristics, not necessarily the same level of brightness as a Kenyan coffee, but at the same time a little bit of that fruit profile in the cup. Day 15 opted for the April Brewer, and the cup is a little bit more interesting through this brew method, at least from these first couple of tries, as it continues to offer that slight smokiness, but the sweetness feels a little bit better articulated with a darker sweetness in line with the listed maple candies. And this is the first time I truly experienced that as being one of the more defined and notable aspects of the cup, though it had always been present up to this point, with the similarities of a syrupy waffle, a little bit more pronounced in this sense, dark sweetness throughout the cup, and it is overall a better name. If you're unaware, one of the notes that they have listed on this coffee is Eggo waffles, and I couldn't necessarily tell if the priming effect was starting to take effect or if it's because the maple was just a little bit more reminiscent of just a waffle-like experience. But this was the first time I said, I can kind of see Eggo waffles and I can kind of see maple candies. Day 17, back through the V60, and the cup is continuing to remain pretty consistent, as it's surprisingly flavorful, and that makes up for the slight roasty qualities of the cup, with the maple and candied nut characteristics being a little bit more pronounced. And on this day, I said once again, it weirdly kind of tastes like a waffle, and once again, I try my best to avoid the priming effect, but I couldn't help but feel like this coffee is actually skewing that way, and I'm not entirely sure if it's because I actually feel it and taste this within this coffee, or if that's the way this coffee actually is. Day 20 through the Chemex with lower temperatures, and it improved a fair bit despite the roasty qualities, as this time it was reminiscent of a darker profiled Kenyan coffee, at least a little bit more so than it had in the past, offering a molasses and maple-like sweetness to the cup. This time I would say it was even more pronounced than it had been in previous days. In addition to that, an almost grape jello-like sense to it with a notable bit of brightness, though still not to the same extent as the Kenyan coffees. Day 23 through the V60 with lower temperatures, and there's a trade-off with the brew methods, as this one seems to prioritize the dark fruit aspects a little bit more. As I said, once it cooled down, it reminded me a bit more of like a grape jello, a grape Kool-Aid, with the maple-like aspects being a little bit more toned down. If I'm being completely honest, I actually had a little bit of a preference for those darker, like sweet aspects, that of course being that molasses maple-like attributes to it. When it tasted like a waffle, I actually really enjoyed that. So if anything, that's what the Chemex seems to offer a little bit more, with a little bit more definition to it, as well as the April brewers. So flatbed brewers might also be better for this coffee. But on day 26, it's the first time I brewed it through the automatic coffee maker, and I actually liked it best with this first try, as I felt like it would be a good fit given the profile of the coffee. But in addition to that, it accentuated the darker purple aspects in the cup, in the sense that I said, okay, even though it's trading off with some of the more maple molasses-like sweetness, I really like the articulation and definition of it, as it was a bit more lavender-like in terms of florality. Slight tart plums, blackberry, currants, berries, just getting a lot of those darker profiled berry fruit aspects within this one. And I said, you know what, this works, let's keep rolling with it. On day 28, same thing. Here on day 29, same thing. As it's been consistent for the most part, as it seems to kind of rotate between the characteristics, just which one seems to be the most dominant is dependent on the brew method that's utilized, as it has a little bit more of a focus on the darker fruit aspects on this day yet again, with a notable bit of the maple and molasses-like aspects. So I feel like even though it was skewing a bit more on the direction that I didn't prefer quite as much, I said that there was enough depth and characteristics from the other aspects, and of course being those darker sweet aspects, maple and molasses, that really seemed to give this one some nice balance and just great depth overall. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So yes, even though there is a notable smoky quality to it, I feel like the definition of the cup, especially through the automatic coffee maker, seemed to help it a lot, especially in terms of the darker profiles of this coffee. So for that reason, I felt like the cleanliness was justified at level 4. And if I'm being completely honest, that feels like a true level 4, as I don't necessarily have anything to knock it too much for. And even the smokiness seemed a little bit more dissipated through that brew method. So not too many complaints in that sense. Not bad. Finish, level 4. With all of the things I've kind of mentioned, the finish isn't necessarily overly long-lasting, but it's a little bit unique in the sense that at times it can offer that slightly tart fruit aspect, but at the same time, I kept going away from the coffee saying that kind of tasted like an Eggo waffle, so I could kind of see that. But even then, it's a very positive experience within this coffee. The finish, it's one that I very much enjoyed, but at the same time, level 4 seems to be a good place for it. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, this coffee was very sweet, and that's going to be a huge credit to them, as that's exactly what I'm looking for when it comes to pretty much any coffee, is that level 4 sweetness. If it's going to be for a wash process coffee, higher side of level 4, or if it actually has a level 5, that's even better. But I don't necessarily want the sweetness to be overbearing. This one right here offered a slightly higher side of level 4, so credit to them. The darker sweetness, that molasses maple, when I was able to get that in abundance, especially when it kind of felt like it was aligned with the listed Eggo waffle, it was positive. So positive in that sense. Level 4 seems really good for this coffee. Grapefruit, level 4. I guess that's what the purple gemstones were. They were just a wide array of darker profiled berries, which of course being those tart currants, as well as the blackberry-like attributes of this one. I can safely say that at no point was I tasting a purple gemstone, but at the same time, I've never tried a purple gemstone in my life before. Caramel, level 4, and that's specifically going to be for the darker profiled sweetness, that molasses and the maple that I keep coming back to, because it's not really a caramelized cup of coffee. I can say that maybe the nutty qualities of this one can be ever so slightly caramelized, but for the most part, after some slight experiences with a nutty component in this coffee, I do have to say that I didn't experience it in as notable an abundance as a lot of the other characteristics, that maple, that weird waffle, and then of course those purple fruit components. So level 4, not necessarily caramel, but much more of that molasses maple syrup sweetness. Then we have a couple of level 3s. We'll start with body level 3. I think that's probably a factor of the brew method that we opted for, because with the Chemex, we're probably bumping that down to a level 2. Not necessarily the most amount of texture, the most amount of body, if I'm being completely honest. Even when I made this tasting, I said probably the lower side of level 3, but yeah, that seems to be a good fit for it. Acidity, level 3. And while I mentioned the brightness a lot throughout this review, I think it's mostly because it was a little bit more of a surprise than I might have expected given the profile of this coffee. But even then, I kept highlighting the fact that it wasn't to the Kenyan-like extent. So level 3 seemed to be a good fit for it. Florality, level 3. That's what I'd mentioned, that even darker floral aspect, a little bit more reminiscent of a lavender for me, feels a pretty good fit at that level 3. Saltiness, level 3. Probably a little generous. I don't necessarily think that I got too many of the nutty qualities within this coffee, especially with all the adjustments we had made. So 3 is probably a little high in that sense, though there were some other slightly salty attributes within this one. Citrus fruit, level 3. I do have to say that I think that was a little bit more a trait of the tart aspects within this coffee, as there wasn't necessarily an overly defined citric component within this cup. Stone fruit, level 3. Those plums, even though they were a little bit more tart in that sense, I could definitely see that being another characteristic within the fruit profiles of this coffee. And then as I'm kind of looking at this tasting, I just briefly want to mention the savoriness, because I think that was a little bit more of a factor of the nutty quality, as well as the fact that it felt a little like a Kenyan coffee at times. So savoriness there at that level 2 mark. And then briefly the smokiness. At times I could say it was bordering on that level 3 mark, but with the automatic coffee maker, level 2 seemed like a good place to put that. As I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I actually do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Let me start with this. For a coffee that may be a slight bit more developed than I necessarily like, I had fun with this coffee at times. When it tasted like that weird maple Eggo waffle, I was like, okay, I mean, I love maple and I love waffles, so the combination of this coming out in a cup of coffee is something that I've not necessarily experienced too often in the past. Couple that with the fact that I wonder how much of a priming effect was actually at play within this coffee, and it just kind of makes me wonder, does this coffee really taste this way? But for me, I do my best to avoid that, and it honestly just tasted this way. So I think that they did a really good job in that sense. And the purple gemstone just offering a little bit more of that purple fruit quality was also a nice kind of contrasting component to that. So this one exceeded my expectation. I'm not going to go out and say this is one of my favorite coffees that we've ever reviewed. I think it's a little bit of a guilty pleasure coffee, as I usually have a couple of these throughout the year. So credit to SK, as everything I've had from them has exceeded my expectations a little bit. So they're a little bit better than I would expect, especially given that they're not necessarily catering to me with their profile. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you're curious about the maple, give it a shot. Let me know what you think if you also get that same sort of experience, because I'm at a loss for just how defined it was at times and just how pronounced it was as well. And if you do like the darker fruit profiles within a coffee, then this one's a nice fit. Obviously, I want you to keep in mind the development of this one being skewed a little further along than I feel like I or a lot of people typically like with their coffees. But even then, it wasn't a huge factor when you're able to get this coffee right, as it's just a little bit more of a subtle secondary characteristic in the background for what's an otherwise very flavorful and very intense cup of coffee. I think I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well, especially if you got the maple. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Vunga washing station wash process for Rwanda from SK Coffee. Thank you for watching.